Hello and welcome to Module 9, Paper, Paper, and More Paper. Yes, you've guessed it, in this video lecture we will be discussing how paper's made, and what you need to know about paper for print production. So on this first screen here we have a diagram of basically how paper is made, and you can see that it begins with the raw materials, our trees, and they get chipped down to smaller and smaller pieces and then are pulped. They go through a chemical pulping and physical pulping situations here, where they just get broken down into its smaller and smaller fibers, and then those fibers get bleached here, and they get swirled and beaten and refined and made into this kind of slurry mixture that looks like really thick milk, looks like cream, and then they can put it onto these it gets a little bit thicker, like pasty, but they can put it onto these sheets that go through these rollers, and the rollers will press out the moisture out of the fibers and press them together to create the sheets of paper. And so through all these various rollers here, they can determine the thickness of the papers. They can apply different coatings to the papers and so on, so that by the end of the rolling process here, they're down to about 5% water and are ready to be cut up and shipped away for production. So here they show some giant rolls that are cut into smaller rolls and then cut into stacks of sheets there. Here's a couple of photos of some giant rolls of paper. If you ever were here during the GP paper refinery in Bellingham, I took a class on a tour there one time, and it's pretty fascinating just to see the size of these rolls and the amount of paper coming through. But you can see here they got slit into shorter rolls, and they get stacked, and they have these special forklifts that have clamps that will stack paper up really high. And I've been in some plants where there's paper rolls like this stacked 4 or 5 up high, which is kind of daunting as you're walking by them thinking, oh boy, I hope the earthquake is not going to happen now. So anyways, this is rolled paper, and it is would be kept on a roll for web presses. The web presses, remember, the paper stays as one long sheet, and they would put the roll onto it. Otherwise, these rolls can go through another machine called a sheeter, and what it does is it just cuts it into press sheets to be able to go onto sheet-fed presses. So we have some basic types of paper, mainly what we'll use for graphic reproduction is the text and book paper, or cover stocks. Bond paper is your basic business paper. For photocopying, it's very thin, it's a low grade type of paper, uncoated, and but for getting nice quality results for offset printing, we would use a text type of paper, book paper. It's a little bit higher quality. It can be coated or uncoated to various surfaces. And then another type of paper is called cover paper, which is thicker, and it's intended to, its job is to protect the pages, the book paper. So one of the main differences between papers is the coating, and that has the biggest effect on you as a designer and the results that you would want to get from your designs. So coating or uncoating, or somewhere in between. What is coating? Over here on the left, in this blue square area, at the bottom here is a cross section of paper, and it shows the bumpy roughness of the paper fibers along the top of the paper, and this would be the bottom of the paper here. And this is considered uncoated, so it's just the full roughness of the paper fibers. And what they can do is they layer in coatings, and it fills in some of the gaps and the little valleys of that roughness and makes it smoother. And so you can fill it into different levels, and you can get different effects of that. So you can get like just a light sheen or a satin. Satin papers are not fully coated, but they're partially coated. Semi-gloss papers and so on. But as they put more and more coating on, it will make the surface smoother and smoother. And so this top paper here would be considered a fully coated, gloss-coated paper. So what does that effect have to do with printing? Over here to the right, they have on this column here, this is uncoated paper, and this side here is coated paper. And you can see that a close-up of an apostrophe or quotation mark here. On the coated paper, you get much sharper edges to your image. You get sharper dot definition, and the color is also brighter because the coating keeps the ink up towards the surface of the paper, and it doesn't bleed into the fibers. On this side here, you can see the ink bleeding into the various fibers, and you get the result is duller colors and less sharp black and white, less sharp definition. And here's just a microscopic view of the coating versus uncoated papers. So if you're looking for something with a high quality photograph reproduction, brilliant colors, sharp definition, you're going to want to go with a coated paper. If you're not too concerned, you can go with uncoated, or if you're looking at something with a more natural appearance to it, uncoated gives more than natural appearance. And here's just a photograph. The top one is coated paper, bottom one is uncoated, simulated. So it's just a little bit less saturation in color and less sharpness. Paper, when you're deciding paper, you would decide on the coating, and then you also decide on the weight of the paper, which is also the thickness. So the thickness is determined in different ways. There's when you're talking to a salesperson and you're asking about paper, they will mention paper in the terms of pounds, like you want 80-pound paper or 100-pound paper. Or they might mention it in term of point, like do you want a 10-point or a 14-point stock? So those are two basic terms, pound and point, to describe the thickness of the paper. And they are done in two different ways. So when they're talking about the pound of a paper, the weight, that's done by measuring 500 sheets. So they'll take 500 sheets of paper and they'll cut it to a basic sheet size, a basic press sheet size. So book paper has a specific size. Cover paper has a specific size. You can see in the diagram on the left, cover paper is cut to 20 by 26 to measure, while book paper is cut to 25 by 38 to measure. But either way, they'll take 500 sheets of it and then physically weigh it. So if 500 sheets of 20 by 26 cover paper weighs 80 pounds, then they would call that 80-pound paper. If you had 500 sheets of cover paper at this size that weighed 100 pounds, that means it's heavier, which would mean that the sheets are thicker, and it would be called 100-pound paper. So 100-pound paper is thicker than 80-pound paper. If you were to measure the other way with a caliper, it's a physical measurement. It looks like the letter C, where it comes down and pinches and it measures the thickness of the paper. And they measure it in thousandths of an inch, and they just call it point. So for example, paper that is 7 thousandths of an inch thick is called 7 point. 14 thousandths of an inch thick is 14 point. So obviously there, where the number is getting larger, the paper is getting thicker. Other qualities of paper to consider would be smoothness or texture, opacity. Some papers, you can see through them a little bit and be able to see what's printed on the back side or on the next page below it. the shade or tint of the color, shade or tint or color of the paper, whether the paper is recycled, and its grain direction. Grain direction is when the paper is being made, the fibers tend to orientate themselves into the same direction that's being done on the machinery. So the fibers are longer than they are wider, and they'll all kind of match up, and they'll create what's called a grain. And there's different ways to test grain on paper. Here's the laying it over the edge of a table. Here is tearing a sheet and rubbing your thumbnail across it to see the amount of waviness or how it tears, to be able to determine the grain. Grain is important for print production because of how paper folds. When you want your binding spine to be going with the grain. Here's an example where the binding spine is going against the grain, and it cracks and sticks out and doesn't fold very nicely. And you get wider folds compared to here in number 2. It's showing the grain going with the spine, and you get a much better fold. So the salesperson will determine, actually it gets determined in pre-press, when they know what paper stock you're going to use, how they will orientate and do the imposition of your artwork according to how it needs to be folded. Just in case you've ever pulled up at different paper sizes and you've seen these paper sizes A5, A4, A1, A0, and have ever wondered what those meant, well, those are just European paper formats. So in Europe and in other parts of the country, or other parts of the world, India, China, they measure paper differently, and they have different standards of paper. So they, for instance, will take an A size piece of paper, and when they cut it in half, you get 2 A1s. And then when you get A1, you cut an A1 in half, you get an A2. When you cut an A2 in half, you get an A3. Cut an A3 in half, you get an A4, and so on. So there's kind of a logic to it that keeps the papers consistent. And one thing to notice here, I've circled in red, is that the standard letter size paper for Europeans is a different size than our letter size paper. Ours is a little bit shorter, but a little bit wider. Letter paper in Europe is just a little bit taller and skinnier. And I did have one print job I had to do, one design job, where I needed to be able to have this brochure printed on both American letter size paper and European letter size paper. So I had to incorporate both margins into my design and make sure everything would fit and not get trimmed off. So that's just a look at the European size papers. Here we have the American standard paper sizes, and we start with the 8.5 by 11 paper here. And when you double at 8.5 by 11, you basically turn it sideways, and you can get 2 sheets of 8.5 by 11 onto one 11 by 17. That's a standard press size. And then going up from there, it kind of doesn't really follow any specific formula or pattern. And we move up to a 17.5 by 22.5. 19 by 25 is a very common press sheet. Your 23 by 35, and then your 25 by 38, which they generally just call that a 40-inch press sheet. 40-inch press sheet. So when it comes to working on designing posters and so on, doing different impositions and layouts, so depending on the size of your artwork, they'll choose a press sheet that closely matches that in order to best save paper and press time. The larger presses, like these big 40-inch, 38-inch press sheets, cost more to run than a smaller press. So that all gets determined on how they do the imposition on what size sheet it should go onto. I'm not expecting you to memorize any of these sheet sizes or the European sheet sizes, so this is just kind of a general knowledge and awareness of the general sizes, sheet sizes. As you talk with the salespeople, you will learn more and more about paper. They know a ton about paper, what works really well. They actually know the papers that work best on their presses. And print shops will have standard papers, a house paper, so to speak. It's a house paper where they order tons of it, and it's their cheapest or lowest cost paper to you. It's not necessarily cheap paper. It's good paper, but it's lowest cost because they order so much of it, and they know it runs well on their presses. And so I really would, you should really ask your salesperson about paper, any questions you have. There's so much being developed in paper that it's hard to know everything. They'll have to contact the paper sales representative, and there's always new papers being developed and new techniques and what papers go with what inks and so on. So some of the questions you should ask yourself when you're designing is what are you trying to communicate, and what paper would best fit with your communication. If you were trying to communicate something really like a new car brochures are often printed on shiny glossy paper because it shows the newness and the reflectivity and the sharpness and the color and the brilliance, compared to if you were trying to print like the community food co-op, hardly prints on glossy paper. They go for the natural uncoated papers to get that more natural feel. Do you need paper that's going to last a long time? Does it need a lifespan? Do you need acid-free papers? Or is this an advertisement that's probably going to be recycled or thrown out within a day or two? How important is it for the readability or the image quality? How is it going to be distributed? What presses are they going to go on to? And some of that, your salesperson will help you figure that out. Basically, though, paper sheets are a little more expensive than web-fed paper. Glossy papers are more expensive than matte or silk papers. Colored paper is more expensive than white paper, and so on. So your salesperson will bring you all of the paper choices. They come loaded with all these sample books, and they will help guide you through the best paper for the best price for what you're trying to communicate. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.